No one truly knew where Aidin des Damnés was. Not anymore. Lucien had made sure of it. At first, maps had been drawn in secret. Captains sketched shorelines by moonlight, marked reefs, coves, and trade routes. But one by one, those maps vanished, stolen, burned, or found in the mouths of the dead. Cartographers went missing. Ships that tried to leave without Lucien's blessing never made it home. Soon, a myth replaced direction. Aidin became a ghost on the sea, a place you didn't find. It found you. Lucien had hired a Moroccan mathematician to recalculate star paths and altered compass readings with magnets buried in the cliffs. At the island's heart, he built a massive iron obelisk disguised as a lighthouse. Its shifting light scrambled navigation. Sailors called it the Devil's Lantern. Only those given passage coins by Lucien's court could return. Everyone else was lost to the ocean or madness. Even the British Navy once tried to chart the island. Their scouts vanished. Their admiral returned pale, mute, and bleeding from the ears. Because Aidin didn't want to be found. It wanted to be forgotten until it chose to be remembered, and by then, it was already too late. Not all battles were fought between armies. In medieval Europe, duels were the ultimate test of personal honor, a deadly solution when insults cut deeper than any blade. Whether between nobles disputing land or knights avenging a slight, duels followed a ritualistic code. Opponents chose weapons, swords, axes, even mounted lances, and met under agreed terms. Witnesses were required. Sometimes a judge presided, and in certain cases, it wasn't just personal, it was legal. Under feudal law, a duel could serve as a trial by combat, where God was believed to grant victory to the righteous. But justice and honor weren't always the same. Skilled fighters often won, regardless of guilt. Wealthy men hired champions to fight in their place. Duels could be rigged, poisoned, or fought in shadows instead of arenas. For knights, honor was everything. A whisper of cowardice or accusation of falsehood could ruin a man's name. In a culture where legacy mattered more than life, many chose the blade over apology. And yet the romance of dueling endured, etched in songs, tapestries, and tales of gallant vengeance. In the medieval world, marriage was a weapon. Sharper than any sword, more binding than any treaty. Kings and nobles didn't marry for love, they married for land, alliances, and leverage. A daughter could be promised before she could walk, her fate decided by fathers and monarchs eager to secure peace. A marriage between rival houses might end decades of war, or ignite a new one if the dowry fell short or the bride failed to produce heirs. Treaties were often sealed with weddings, where a young princess became a living peace offering. But these marriages rarely ensured lasting stability. If the groom died young, if a childless union dragged on, or if succession was disputed, the alliance could collapse overnight. Even more disturbing was the practice of royal hostageship. Noble children were sent to enemy courts to ensure their parents kept promises. These hostages were treated well, fed, educated, sometimes even knighted, but they lived under constant threat. If a treaty was broken, the penalty might be execution. Love was never the point, power was. These living symbols of peace walked a tightrope between diplomacy and death. It was small, no bigger than a silver doubloon, but it ruled the fate of every soul who stepped foot on the island. The coin of passage, stamped with Lucien's sigil, a serpent coiled around a crown. It shimmered oddly, as if forged from metal not found in any kingdom. Some swore it was cursed, others claimed it was blessed. But one thing was certain, without the coin, no ship dared land at Aidin des Damnés, and none were allowed to leave. The coin was both invitation and leash. Given only by the Corsair's court or Lucien himself, it granted access to safe harbors, food, protection, and a place at the table, no matter your past. Pirates carried it with pride. Exiled nobles wept upon receiving it. Spies hid theirs in hollowed teeth. Lose it, and you were nothing. Steal one, and the punishment was worse than death. They didn't hang you. They took you to the reef of bones and left you chained to drown with the tide, your screams muffled by gulls. Some said the coins could whisper, that they grew warmer when danger was near, that Lucien could feel every one of them, no matter where it sailed. Because the island didn't just own your body, it owned your way back. How can killing be righteous? That was the question medieval theologians wrestled with, and the answer became just war theory. Rooted in the works of St. Augustine and later expanded by St. Thomas Aquinas, this doctrine tried to reconcile Christian morality with the brutal reality of warfare. War, they argued, could be justified if it met certain conditions. It had to be waged by a legitimate authority for a just cause, and with the right intention, not revenge or conquest, but peace and justice. Sounds noble, but in practice, just war theory became a flexible tool used to sanctify conquest, colonization, and even holy wars. A king seeking land could claim he was restoring order. A pope could declare a crusade, framing slaughter as salvation. Knights weren't just fighters, they were now soldiers of Christ. Slaying infidels became a form of piety. But did this theology restrain violence or encourage it? On the battlefield, there was little time for moral philosophy. Villages burned, armies marched, and priests often blessed the swords before they spilled blood. Just war theory didn't eliminate war, it gave it moral cover. Long after swords were sheathed and castles crumbled, the ideals of medieval warfare still echo in modern society. Chivalry, just war theory, and codes of honor didn't vanish, they evolved. Modern militaries operate under rules of engagement, Geneva Conventions, and ethical codes that mirror medieval attempts to restrain violence. The idea that war must have a just cause, be declared by legitimate authority, and protect non-combatants owes much to thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas. Military academies still teach honor, duty, courage, echoes of the knightly virtues. Soldiers take oaths, not unlike medieval vows of fealty. Even the romantic image of the noble warrior lives on in films, literature, and national mythologies. But the contradictions remain. Just as medieval knights preached honor while committing atrocities, modern powers often cloak ambition in morality. We still wage just wars for oil, territory, or ideology, blessed by modern media instead of papal bulls. So did medieval ethics civilize war, or simply give it better PR? The battlefield may have changed, the questions have not. When swords clashed and kingdoms bled, Europe often turned to one authority above kings, the Pope. As the spiritual head of Christendom, the Pope had the power to bless armies or forbid war entirely. His voice could unite rivals or deepen divisions. Papal mediation was seen as divine intervention. A papal envoy arriving in a war camp was treated with awe. He carried scrolls bearing the seal of Rome, urging kings to negotiate, threatening excommunication for those who refused. Peace imposed by the Pope had holy weight, disobey and risk your soul. But peace wasn't always pure. Behind closed doors, papal decisions were shaped by politics, alliances and bribes. Popes favored allies, punished enemies, and sometimes brokered peace only to advance their own power. During the 100 Years' War, multiple popes tried to end hostilities between England and France. Most failed, some made it worse. Even worse was when rival popes, like during the Western Schism, supported different sides, blessing opposing armies with the same divine authority. To many, papal peace felt like manipulation wrapped in scripture, a tool, not a truth. Sieges were the most brutal form of medieval warfare, long, desperate, and terrifying. No gallant charges or chivalric duels here, just starvation, disease, deception, and the slow grinding of will. When a castle or city refused to surrender, an army would surround it, cutting off supplies. Inside, defenders rationed food, drank filthy water, and watched neighbors die. Some even resorted to eating rats or each other. Outside the walls, besiegers built towers, dug tunnels, and launched flaming projectiles or rotting corpses to spread disease. But even war had rules. Chivalric codes dictated that if defenders resisted and lost, the attackers were justified in pillaging, burning, and killing everyone inside. That single decision, to hold or yield, could mean life or annihilation. There were exceptions. Some besiegers offered generous terms to gain a quick surrender. Others broke truces and butchered captives after false negotiations. Treachery was common, and sometimes celebrated. Siege warfare revealed the limits of medieval honor. When food ran out and walls crumbled, chivalry died with the starving. And yet, stories of brave last stands, of women fighting from the ramparts and knights defending the gates to their final breath, still echoed through legend. For all its talk of honor, medieval warfare was riddled with betrayal. Deals broken, oaths shattered, comrades turned enemies, all cloaked in the language of loyalty. One of the most infamous examples, the Battle of Montgizar, 1177. Saladin's vast army outnumbered the Christians 10-1, but victory turned on a shocking betrayal. Several of Saladin's own emirs withheld their troops, resentful of his growing power. Saladin barely escaped with his life. Elsewhere, knights would switch sides mid-battle, assassinate allies during peace talks, or leak fortress plans for coin. Castles changed hands not just by siege, but by bribery. Servants opened gates in the night, guards faked sleep, loyalty had a price. Even kings betrayed kings. The 100 Years' War was riddled with backroom deals. One year, a noble fought for France, the next, for England. His banners changed, but his ambition did not. Chivalric codes promised loyalty to lord and honor, but in the chaos of war, survival often outweighed virtue. Some saw betrayal not as sin, but as strategy. And still, poets sang of noble heroes, as if honor had never been bought. Medieval warfare is often remembered through rose-tinted lenses. Noble knights showing mercy, fighting fair, and sparing the helpless. But how much of that was truth, and how much carefully crafted myth? The chivalric code preached restraint. No attacking the unarmed, no striking a man from behind, no harming women or clergy. These ideals filled romances and troubadour songs, painting war as a test of virtue. But on real battlefields, chivalry was often a fantasy. Knights trampled peasants, burned crops, and looted monasteries. Surrendering enemies were executed if ransom wasn't profitable. Even during Christian wars, churches were torched and priests slain. In the Battle of Agincourt, 1415, English knights executed hundreds of French prisoners out of fear they might rise again, a brutal act that shocked even their allies. Chivalry worked best between nobles. A captured count might be spared, but a commoner? Forgotten. The ethics were selective. Honor among elites, silence for the rest. Still, these myths mattered. They shaped how war was justified, remembered, and glorified. They offered a moral mask for violence and comfort for those who survived it. Not every battle in the Middle Ages was fought with swords. Some were waged with words, across candlelit halls, inked scrolls, and whispered promises. In a world of shifting allegiances and fragile thrones, diplomacy was survival. Medieval rulers relied on envoys, scribes, and noble messengers to forge alliances and stave off war. Treaties were sealed with wax and wine, sometimes even with blood oaths. A single misstep in language could spark a feud. A clever phrase could buy peace. But diplomacy wasn't noble, it was dangerous. Ambassadors were often held hostage, poisoned, or murdered if talks soured. Trust was rare, treachery common. Peace treaties could be broken as easily as parchment. Marriage was a powerful diplomatic tool. Kings traded daughters like chess pieces, each union a potential peace pact or land claim. A royal wedding might stop an invasion or spark one. The church played its role too, acting as mediator, enforcer, or silent observer. Papal legates traveled across kingdoms, offering blessings or excommunications to push negotiations their way. In an age soaked in blood, words could be just as sharp as blades. In medieval Europe, war wasn't just a political act. It was often a spiritual one. The church stood not outside the battlefield, but at its very heart, shaping who fought, when, and why. Priests marched with armies, blessing swords and banners, offering mass before battle, and declaring sins forgiven for those who fought in righteous wars. A knight killing in God's name wasn't a sinner, he was a holy warrior. Popes declared crusades, bishops funded sieges, monasteries housed soldiers, and sermons from the pulpit fueled hatred of pagans, heretics, and infidels, justifying horrors under a divine banner. But this wasn't merely about faith, it was about control. By tying warfare to salvation, the church gained enormous influence. Knights fought not just for gold or glory, but to save their souls. Refuse a crusade, and you might be branded a coward, or worse, a sinner. And yet, contradictions abounded. Christians slaughtered Christians. Armies burned monasteries. Priests died with swords in hand, despite canon law forbidding clergy from shedding blood. The church preached peace, while fueling war. Its moral authority didn't tame violence, it often sanctified it. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd at Clermont and cried, "Deus vult," God wills it. With those words, the First Crusade was born, and thousands of knights set out to reclaim the Holy Land. But was it truly about faith, or something darker? The Crusades were sold as holy missions, a way to cleanse sin, serve God, and rescue fellow Christians. Knights who joined were promised salvation, but under the banner of the cross, they sacked cities, looted treasures, and slaughtered thousands, sometimes even fellow Christians. Beneath the surface of religious zeal lay deep political motives. European nobles sought land, riches, and titles. The papacy saw a chance to unify Christendom and assert dominance. Younger sons, landless due to primogeniture, saw a path to wealth and glory. The campaigns stretched across centuries, not just to Jerusalem, but to Spain, the Baltics, and even Constantinople. The Fourth Crusade didn't fight Muslims, it attacked Christian Byzantines, looting one of the greatest cities in the world. For many, the Crusades became a justified war of expansion, masked in divine rhetoric. Was it about defending the faith, or was God's will just an excuse? Imagine a knight, his armor gleaming under the midday sun, raising his sword not to kill, but to spare a fallen enemy. Was this honor or propaganda? Medieval warfare is often wrapped in the myth of noble chivalry, gallant knights, fair duels, and codes of justice, but the truth is far bloodier and far more complex. Chivalry wasn't born out of kindness, it was forged in fire, by warlords, kings, and popes desperate to restrain violence among their own soldiers. The so-called code told knights when it was okay to slaughter and when to show mercy, but only if it suited the church, or their lord, or their pride. The church developed just war theory, attempting to moralize war itself. Knights were taught to kill in the name of justice, God, or vengeance, but never for greed. Yet battlefields were soaked in blood from peasants, civilians, and other Christians alike. So what was it really? A moral compass, or a public performance? This chapter launches us into the contradictions of medieval warfare, where mercy and murder rode side by side, and a knight's sword could bless or butcher with equal ease. Becoming a knight wasn't just about wielding a sword, it was about swearing an oath. A solemn vow, often made before God, to protect the weak, serve a lord faithfully, and uphold the ideals of courage, loyalty, and honor. But how binding were these promises in the brutal chaos of war? The path to knighthood began in childhood. A noble boy would become a page, then a squire, learning to ride, hunt, and fight. But just as importantly, he was drilled in the values of piety, courtesy, and discipline. Before dubbing, a knight would fast, confess his sins, and spend the night in vigil beside his sword, sometimes in a church. At dawn, he'd be blessed, armed, and knighted. But these lofty ideals didn't always survive the battlefield. Some knights became bandits, raiding villages or burning churches. Others betrayed their lords or sold their swords to the highest bidder. The oath was sacred, but it was also political and easily twisted. Still, for many, the knightly code was real, a moral framework in a violent world. It gave meaning to bloodshed and restraint to power. Next, we explore how this oath evolved. Was it truly spiritual or just a tool of control? The chivalric code wasn't written overnight. It evolved over centuries, shaped by war, religion, and the shifting ambitions of kings and clerics. In its earliest form, chivalry was less about honor and more about loyalty to a lord. Knights were expected to fight bravely and obey orders. Morality had little to do with it. But as the church gained power, a transformation began. Bishops and popes, alarmed by knightly violence, sought to Christianize warfare. Movements like the Peace of God and Truce of God emerged, attempting to limit who could be attacked and when. By the 12th century, chivalry had absorbed religious elements: defend the church, protect the innocent, fight for justice. Romantic literature added yet another layer. Tales of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table painted an idealized vision: knights rescuing maidens, slaying dragons, and never striking a foe from behind. But this was myth more than reality. Real knights often pillaged, raped, and ignored all codes if it suited them. Still, the idea of chivalry persisted, part law, part faith, part fantasy. Over time, this evolving code became a mirror. It reflected what medieval society wanted to believe about its warriors, even if it wasn't true.